All right, welcome to episode 29 of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we're going to talk about something very interesting, very near and dear to our hearts, the pros and cons of pessimism and optimism. And by the way, before we start, I'm going to point out the elephant in the room. You can see I have no hair. Decided to do an experiment. Why not? Just for fun. Saw I was balding. I was thinking, hey man, take the plunge. Let's see what it would look like if you take it all off. It's not so bad. Like, I could see myself. I'm looking at the camera right now. It's not bad, but it's definitely very weird. I've not acclimated to this. This is just like since yesterday. Gotten okay feedback. What do you think?
It sounds like you're a glass half full kind of guy.
That's it. It's not like it looks good. It looks bad. It's like you sound like a glass half full kind of guy.
It sounds like everything is okay.
That's true. So anyway,
and why do you need my validation anyway?
Feedback is important. I don't need... Actually, we should do an episode on validation. What? Whether you need validation or not.
Yeah, and when is it enough validation for self-esteem?
That's right.
All right, cool.
Yeah. But...
All right, anyway. What you got?
So, would you consider yourself an optimist or a pessimist?
Naturally, pessimist.
Really? Why?
Yeah, oh my god, man. So that one, it's a hard question to answer, I guess. So it's partially genetic, obviously. So, obviously for the people who kind of understand, I guess, or study psychology. So it's partially genetic, and then it's also partially shit from my childhood, because, like, whatever, stuff that I talked about, writing, pretty much on past episodes. Life was kind of shitty when I was a kid. So then I was like, oh, great. So, like, everybody kind of sucks and the world is pretty shitty. So my kind of thinking was influenced by that, and then depression runs in my family. So, like, for me to change my way of thinking, like, I have to actually work on it.
Wow.
Yeah, what about you?
Me? Nowadays, I would definitely consider myself more of an optimist. I try to be realistic as well. Like, I do like the idea of, taking a look at every single variable that might come up in my mind about a situation or an anticipated event. And I try to kind of have them all kind of floating around and kind of decide how things might go in order to predict the situation. So in that sense, I might have a certain, like a characteristic of a pessimist who would think of all possible realities and take the time to do that and all that. But I do tend to like to pick the one that I think is the best of all possible realities, but is still as close to realistic as possible. So you could argue I'm somewhere in the middle, but I do tend to lean towards optimism. That might be just some kind of like a biased response.
And is that the case? Like, that's how it's always been, or is it something you have to work toward?
Oh my god! Oh no!
Yeah.
I've definitely been a pessimist. I used to think that I used to prepare for the worst possible scenario. Actually, in some cases I still do. But I would prepare for the worst possible scenario, so this way, if that's what was going to happen, I would be prepared and I can kind of act accordingly. I would never imagine like the best of all possible realities and aim towards that. I would just kind of think what's the worst possible thing that can happen and sort of go by that. And there is a validity to that view, right? But I suppose there were blind spots maybe to better paths I could have taken, perhaps. It's definitely caused me a lot of that thinking. Oh,
first sneeze on the show.
We're gonna edit that out. No, I'm just kidding. So, why did that sneeze throw me off? No, I'm just kidding.
Because you weren't expecting it.
I wasn't expecting it.
You should have. See, if you were pessimistic, you would have been prepared.
That's right.
So, like, I always prepare for your coughs.
That's true. Yeah. Not yet, though. Always before the show. Nobody knows about that.
But yeah, you were saying how you were naturally pessimistic and then you had to work on it? The journey?
Yeah, so... I used to be very neurotic with my thinking. And it just caused a lot of you could say unnecessary suffering while kind of contemplating all these realities. It's also like kind of like that Mark Twain quote. Something about the many things that he's imagined going wrong. Only some like. Oh my god, I can't remember.
Well, it's sort of like the Epictetus quote, where he says pretty much that the anxieties that we focus on are way more distant from reality than we think.
Yes, and then also something along the lines of like, I I've experienced many bad things, something along those lines, but most of them never happened.
Yeah. Same thing as Epictetus was saying. Right. It's like most of our fears are imagined.
Yeah. So I mean, but there were definitely good things about being a pessimist. Like I would imagine all these different possibilities of things that can go wrong and all that. It put a lot more of my thinking power into how I would deal with certain situations.
Right.
So kind of exercise that muscle of sort of seeing all these different perspectives that from where something, how things can go.
Yeah.
That made my thinking a little more balanced, because then I'd start to think, what is this person thinking, or how does this variable influence this situation like this, instead of just kind of being like single-minded. Although there is something to be said about being single-minded in your approach and that kind of focus.
Yeah.
That level of focus is amazing, actually. And the things that you can accomplish with extreme focus is definitely not something to be like scoffed at, for sure. So I mean, yeah. So actually, before we started doing this show, we were looking at the work of Martin Seligman, and he used to be president of the APA, American Psychological Association. He's a clinical.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, he was a clinical psychologist. Wrote many books, also self-help books as well, and a lot of them are referred to by other clinical psychologists and therapists to like kind of reference his work. He's like up there.
Yes, yeah.
So there's a book he wrote. It's called Learned Optimism, right? And he actually discussed what are some of the pros and cons of, or not even pros and cons. He would talk about the differences between what a pessimist is like and what an optimist is like. And for example, one thing that he happened to note was that pessimists, they tend to get sick more often. They tend to blame them. They find fault in themselves. For example, let's see. Actually, I have it written down. Whatever. I was going to do it all off the top of my head, but
unnecessary.
So a pessimist tends to give up more easily, is more easily depressed, ill more frequently. An optimist tends to achieve more, has better health, lives longer, and according to research that was cited in his book, lower cancer rates as well. So, I mean, I don't have that particular citation, but that's okay. We can refer to the book if anything. But yeah, it looks like pessimists have a certain like explanatory style that's different from an optimist.
And do you remember in terms of like his work, how did he define the two terms? Like, what did it mean to be optimistic and pessimistic to him?
Well, the optimist tends to see the best of all possible worlds, and the pessimist tends to be more grounded towards reality, but also kind of this sort of negative. You would think they think that the negative is more likely to happen, or they prepare for the negative, whereas the optimist would prepare for the positive.
Yeah, and I would guess that it would probably exist on the spectrum, where like sort of the extreme version of a pessimism is somebody who already expects negativity, not just prepares for it, or I guess not only believes that it's likely, but probably thinks that it's inevitable. Whereas the sort of pure optimist, if that even exists, believes that everything sort of positive is inevitable.
Right. So actually, in his work, he does discuss that there's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that takes place. For example, for a pessimist, if you're expecting negative, you're pretty much going to take yourself down a trajectory that will allow for more negativity to occur. This is not to say something along the lines of, because here's the thing, scientifically it makes sense, right? If you expect something bad is going to happen, and you're preparing for that, then it's not like we're saying anything quote unquote woo woo, right? It's like if you expect something positive to happen, the self-fulfilling prophecy, you'll have more positive things like that.
I think what you're saying is that there's a kind of middle ground, which is your behavior and the way you present yourself.
Exactly. Your behavior is subtly affected by these expectations.
Sometimes even not so subtly.
And sometimes not even not so subtly. That's right. So yeah, there's an aspect to that. There's this self-fulfilling prophecy that takes place. And so, I mean, this goes without saying, really, but, I mean, you would think that being an optimist would be the ideal way to go about things, right? You expect the positive, you would then kind of encourage events to kind of go down a certain path that would be beneficial to you, perhaps even others, right?
Yeah.
But I would argue that pessimism has something to it too. For example, you wouldn't want your accountant to be an optimist, or maybe you would. I'm not sure, but I mean, say your accountant's like, hey, I think that you're doing just fine with your finances. I think we can expect you to make more money next year, all of that, and have all these like sorts. I mean, this is very general as far as examples go, but I suppose you kind of want your accountant to be a little more conservative in their thinking, or like if they're a pessimist, they would kind of prepare for the worst in terms of your finances. They would think like, no, you need to save this much in case this happens. You need to, or what if you don't make this much money next year? You need to prepare for that.
So I think what at least my interpretation, I think what you're saying is that you want him to veer closer to the pessimistic end of the spectrum than be too optimistic.
Yeah, or even let's take gambling for instance, right? If you're a very optimistic gambler, of course, yes, you would take higher risks.
Yeah.
Higher risks tend to mean higher rewards if you do, if you're successful. But if you're a pessimist with your gambling, you may decide not to take those risks and end up losing like a lot of money. Or let's relate.
You'd be reckless. You could be reckless because you're like, yeah, who cares anyway? Right. I'm going to lose it, so might as well have fun. Sometimes people unfortunately think that way.
Or the lottery, playing the lottery.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's also true. It's like
an optimist might tend to buy up all those lottery tickets every week or every day or something like that. Pessimist might think, no, the statistics aren't in my favor. Why would I play the lottery? I don't think it's worth it. Yeah. That actually tends to be the way I go about it. Yeah. So you could say in that aspect, I tend to lean towards pessimism. I feel like it's just as an aside, feels like a waste of resources. Like, because for a chance to win such a huge amount of money, but then you keep losing on the path to that.
That's pretty much gambling in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Interesting how people do it. And so, like, with optimism, I think, like, what's obviously why I do it and what's really cool about it is that even a lot of times I think it's much more about the thinking style and it affecting you in terms of your mental health than the actual outcomes. So this is going to be kind of a tricky subject for me to touch on. So the major thing, the blowback that I get from people in therapy is like, oh, well, you're kind of teaching me bullshit, right? Like, I don't want to learn, like, your positive, like, thinking crap, right? They don't say it like that, but it's something along those lines. And so what I try to kind of focus on is that first I tell them that what I want to do is help you become more of a realistic thinker, right, rather than a positive or a negative thinker. Because if you're too positive, what happens is like you're sort of you're not concerned with whatever kind of issues are going on in your life. You're like, things will just work themselves out, right? That's too positive on one end of the spectrum. And then obviously if you're too negative, you're not seeing the good in your life, or especially of yourself. And so what I try to tell people is more so than anything is I'm going to help you become a more realistic thinker, to the extent that that's possible. Obviously, we're always going to have some sort of level of bias. But the point is that when it comes to optimistic thinking, I think the research that you pointed to was so important is because I don't think it's so much about being like an optimistic thinker in the sense of the good things are going to happen, but I think if you are an optimistic thinker, you automatically make something good happen. Because if you're always in not always, again, because it's not supposed to be absolute, but if you're more so than not in a sort of cheery and positive mood, again, does not have to be absolute and shouldn't, because we should experience the plethora of our feelings. But for people who are more optimistic, they're just generally happier, right? They take more care of themselves. They have better relationships with people. It's like that conversation you and I had when we were talking with Liz about stepping out of the house. If you expect people to be friendly, chances are you'll have more positive interactions.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. If you expect them to be assholes, you're going to shut yourself down and you're not going to want anything to do with them. And so the point is not so much about the result of the optimistic thinking in terms of the actual physical consequence, I think, but I think it's the way it kind of, it's still sort of hard to differentiate. So not even that. So not, I guess, in the long-term physical consequence of where the optimistic thinking goes, but even in the short term and how it affects you kind of mentally or emotionally. Because that, in a sense, or maybe, wow, this is kind of tough. So maybe it's not the outcome itself at all that we should focus on, whether it's the short term or the long term. But it's the fact that if we are more optimistic in our thinking, that we just feel much better, right? So even if, like, let's say we push aside the fact that we're nicer to people and people are nicer to us, like, we just generally feel better, like, throughout the day, if we feel much more sort of happier or kind of like safer in our world. So whether or not that's true, I mean, that's, I think, something else. And obviously the preference is that you're more realistic in your thinking. But if you have to choose between optimistic or pessimistic, I think the thinking in itself should be, or the sort of emotional effect of the thinking in itself can be a lot for, or enough for a lot of people in terms of just choosing that one over the pessimism.
What's interesting is that you touched on with our conversation with Liz about expectations about people. So once upon a time, this is when I was working on becoming a little more confident. There was a mindset that I tried to embrace. Verbatim. Everyone in the world is your friend. Right. So it's not that I didn't think like that beforehand, but there was this thing about strangers not knowing how to just like kind of talk to somebody right off the bat, not knowing anything about them. I used to require more information in order to engage in conversation with someone. If I didn't know, why take the risk? Something like that. And that would be my pessimistic view. Both
unrealistic, right? Whether optimistic or pessimistic. But I think what you're saying is you chose the sort of the more preferable form of thinking because it was more helpful to you.
Well, check this out. So what I did was I trained myself to try to embrace that mindset. I'm not saying that I did fully, but in pursuing, attempting to embrace that sort of mindset where, let's say, everyone in the world is my friend, like everywhere I go, this is a potential person I can meet. They're probably not so different from myself. Maybe they have the same fears that I have about meeting new people. This kind of puts us on a sort of even playing field. And that actually dramatically changed my ability to communicate with people. So I wouldn't say that I fully embraced that everyone in the world is my friend because I don't even know how to really measure that to the extent of how to...
That's really cool. Wow.
Yeah.
So it's like you're saying that instead of sort of realistic thinking, you just chose optimistic thinking. Not in the sense of you fully bought into it, as in did you believe it? Oh, it's like that behavior...
I tried to.
Oh, I
tried to fully buy into it.
But it's like you're acting as if that's true. Remember that term that we talked about from behaviorism? It's like when we say that you don't have to believe it, right? Because your brain can't just necessarily accept something as a fact because you want it to. But act as if you believe it. So it's like, wow, this is so interesting. So it's like kind of like the middle ground. So the middle ground within the middle ground. It's like optimistic thinking is fully buying into life being great. Pessimistic thinking is fully buying into that life is shit. Realistic thinking is kind of trying your best to see the world as it is. And then even within realistic thinking, you can actually just hold on to optimistic thinking while not buying into it, just to see kind of what would happen and if life would be different.
Yeah, like something to kind of shoot towards. Right? Wow. So it's kind of like seeing the benefit of thinking in a positive way without, I suppose, I was about to say without buying into some sort of delusion.
Yes.
But that's not exactly... It's not a delusion to think that everyone is your friend or something.
Technically
like
it is. So in the clinical sense, right? Not in an offensive sense of like you're crazy, but in the sense of like you're believing something without any actual evidence for it, right? And it's like this rigidly held belief, right? Which may even be contested, and you're like, no, I don't care, I'm still going to believe in it. So technically it is a delusion, and it's not meant to be an offensive term.
Well, either way, something... Yeah, I like it as something to shoot towards because... It kind of, it's interesting what it does to you. Like, for me, again, like, the kinds of people that I ended up meeting and interacting with, if I didn't embrace that kind of mindset, I would have been more shut off. I'm already kind of an introvert naturally, anyway, but I would have been more locked up in that. So, which is why Martin Seligman's book is interesting. It's literally called Learned Optimism. He actually takes you through the process of attempting to learn to be more optimistic, and by kind of highlighting what are the character traits of someone who's a pessimist, what are the character traits of someone who's an optimist, and kind of breaking down the mindsets that kind of that each kind of person would have. It kind of helps kind of organize things in your own mind to kind of find that place in yourself where you could attempt to maybe learn to be more optimistic if you were coming more from that pessimistic spectrum or pessimistic side of things.
So what are the traits of an optimist?
Traits of an optimist. Putting me on the spot, Leon.
Do you remember? It's okay if you don't.
I mean, they're more optimistic. No, I'm just kidding. Like, for example, someone who is an optimist has more of like a can-do attitude. Like,
Gotcha.
I can do this.
Right.
Someone who's...
so a high sense of self-efficacy, where they believe they can kind of master their environment.
Or they at least believe that they can attempt to do it.
Okay.
Say even an optimist fails in their attempts in undertaking some sort of task. Instead of thinking that, okay, I failed, that's it.
Yeah.
Don't try again. They have more of that, to go back to that growth-based mindset, they think that they can attempt to try this again. Maybe certain variables weren't in their proper place in order for things to occur.
So they sort of look at failure from the context of circumstance rather than like blaming themselves.
Yes, yeah. Wow, thank you for saying that. Yes, that brings me back actually.
Yeah.
Okay, so a pessimist, for instance, would think that it's their fault if they would, let's say they think they're stupid or something like that. They wouldn't think that it's possible that they can learn, that they can educate themselves. That there's, I have a quote here. Where is it? People who believe themselves stupid rather than uneducated don't take action to improve their mind.
Right.
So the optimist would just think, okay, I didn't get it this time. Maybe I'll get it next time. Maybe I can try this thing or that thing. I can try again. Pessimist, it wouldn't work out the way. And of course, there are varying degrees of pessimism. Maybe somebody who is an extreme pessimist would fully stop. Maybe someone who's not so pessimistic, maybe they wouldn't gravitate towards like forever not taking any sorts of action. But again, they do tend to lean towards the negative.
Right, so there'd be just minimal risk.
Yeah. So, I don't know. But, I mean, in your experience, right, would you say you're more optimistic these days than you used to be, or...
Yeah, most definitely, man. So just obviously learning psychology helps a lot. And so I try my best not to so I actually try this kind of sucks. So it's not necessarily that great of a thing. So what research shows is that people who are mildly, majorly depressed, right, which is something that I've struggled with, and I'm kind of like sort of there on that sort of like in that hum level.
Currently?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's like it's something that doesn't really go away.
Cool.
It's something that's like something. It's like it's there, but it's like I'm high functioning, right? So I could do all of these other things, but then like there are like kind of these moments where I'm like, oh, everything sucks, right? So what research shows is that people who are mildly, majorly depressed, right, they're actually more pessimistic, right? So they're realistic, one could say. So now I'm sorry, not that they're more pessimistic, they're more realistic. So people who are mildly, because the nuance here is important, because sometimes people say, oh, well, depressed people are really realistic thinkers, and that's not true. So people who are mildly depressed are really realistic thinkers. So the shitty thing for me is that because like I'm like super critical, and not in the sense of like I attack people, but critical in the sense of analytical. So my mind, like I can't force myself to believe bullshit, right? So even if I try to act as if, a lot of times it's very hard to. I'm not saying it's impossible for me, but it takes a ton of effort. So for me, realistic thinking is pretty much now, at least, like the natural response. So I'm not pessimistic as I was before. At least not fully, right? For the most part, I would say I'm more realistic, right? And again, I'm probably still more toward the pessimistic spectrum in the sense of there are times and kind of these little clusters of moments where I'm like, oh, this isn't going anywhere, right? Podcast being a great example, right? I've had many moments where I'm like, this isn't going anywhere. I'm like, why are we doing this? Even though there's no evidence for it, right? But for the most part, I'm more realistic than not. So I can say, okay, it's not great, but it's not bad either, right? So it's like something in the middle. So unfortunately, with that, I'm not happy most of the time, right? Because I do see things, or at least to whatever extent I think. I don't even know. So I see things as they are. Maybe I don't, but whatever. The point is, that's why kind of like for me, mild major depression is usually my natural state, because for the most part, I have realistic thinking. So like if I had to, or if I wanted to really try optimistic thinking and to cultivate it, it would go so deeply against my nature. And so what we know about personalities is that unfortunately they don't change much over time. So for me to go from like a hardcore pessimist to something sort of in the middle, like being a realist, is a major fucking accomplishment.
100%. I see what you mean.
Yeah. So I'm not even like that upset about it. So for me to say that like I struggle with mild major depression is actually a really wonderful thing, because a long time ago I was deeply depressed and I was super pessimistic. And if you were to ask me like where my life was going, I would have been like, nowhere. It's terrible. Everything is just terrible. So for me to go from that to the realistic part of the sort of, I guess, the spectrum, it was a really good thing. And so do I ever see myself like actually being more of an optimist? Absolutely not. So there are moments where I feel optimistic. So it's not one of those things that's black and white. So like, let's say for the most part I'm in the middle, I'm realistic, right? Let's say if we had to quantify it, let's say 50% I'm realistic, right? Or maybe a little more. Let's say 60% I'm realistic, right? Then maybe 25% so 25% I'm pessimistic and like 15% I'm optimistic, right? So there's these little pockets like where something good happens to us and I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like something really great is going to happen. But if I had to quantify it, it happens very rarely. But it's like I'm all over kind of the place. You ever...
That's wait, yeah. What were you gonna ask?
Oh yeah, I want to hear you.
So one thing I wanted to say is that whole. So first of all, that sounds healthy, right? And also the fact that there's a marked sort of increase compared to like how you were years ago compared to now.
Yeah.
Progress is progress at the end of the day. Even if like it's not like, oh, I'm a superhuman now. I have a complete positive outlook, and I could still somehow acknowledge all the negative. But then pick the best possible course of action.
Right.
Also, I never react to anything.
Yes.
But somehow I respond perfectly.
Right.
And also, I'm completely zenned out. I don't have any erroneous thoughts.
That'd be great.
It's,
That's the ideal. Most definitely.
It's an ideal. It's something to shoot towards,
yes.
right? And if you're already better, like, now than you were before, who's going to ask more? That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's... Even if you're 1% different today than you were years ago, which is not the case, but say it was,
I hear you.
Still some kind of difference, something to work with, right?
Yeah. And it's not that I hate it. I mean, it sucks, obviously, during the down moments and, like, when I do feel more pessimistic than not. But, I mean, I try, obviously, my best to use, like, the CBT stuff and the tools that I've learned, like, pretty much to kind of try to overcome...
CBD?
CBT.
Definitely
not CBD.
Yeah,
I hear you. But, like, yeah, pretty much to try to overcome it. So, look, and I'm not even saying it always works, because sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes the intuitions are really fucking strong. But the point is that more like, not than I'm okay. Like, if you ever... So, you know how, like, you ask people, like, hey, how are you doing? And they say good, and, like, a lot of times they're full of shit. I'm not like that. Like, if I tell you I'm doing good or I'm doing solid, I'm usually doing... Like, 90% of the time I'm not lying. So, 10% probably I am. But for the most part, like, I would probably say if something's wrong. But, like, if I say I'm doing good, that just means I'm okay. Like, I'm content. Everything is fine. Yeah.
So, that thing about, where you said, like, that whole acting as if thing, where you... How should I put this? Where you said that you have a trouble with that, right? Because of that realistic thinking. One thing that actually helped me to act as if, it depends on what we're talking about, is if somebody who I look up to as like either a role model or somebody just worth respecting, if they suggest something to me and they said like, this worked for me, right? Even if it's something really out there, right? For example, when I first heard of The Power of Now.
Really? You read that book?
Have you read The Power of Now? Have you heard of this book? No, so, like, when I first read that book, or before that, somebody who I really respected suggested it. And they seemed like such a balanced thinker. They looked like somebody to me who... I completely resonated with. I thought of them as just like this sort of elite level thinker. I was thinking, okay, if they're gonna suggest this kind of book, even if this is not something that I'm used to, I will try it. See, I'm gonna act as if. I didn't say that at the time. I might have said something like, I'm gonna believe this is real, or I'm gonna act as if I believe this is real. Same thing. I just didn't use that phrase. I just don't want to, be dishonest with that.
I like that. That's really honest of you. Damn, that's really cool. But I hear you.
Yeah, so it was basically that line of thinking. And so, so I tried it, and then it worked for me, only because somebody who I had trusted had suggested this, right? If, let's say, I don't know, like say I was already, this is a bad example, sort of, because I already think the way I do. But say I was pessimistic, or, I don't know, depressed, I didn't know anything about psychology, then I heard somebody like Jason Silva talking about flow and awe, and the way he gets really enamored, like he gets, when he gets in line with his speaking, and he starts talking very passionately about the current state of technology, or how to get into a flow state. His conversations with, for example, Stephen Kotler about getting into flow and things like along that things of that nature. Because I respect him, I would then try to learn more about what that is, and then try to see if I can get into a flow state or something like that. It would just kind of spark my interest.
I get it.
Before that, if I didn't know about what it is, if a friend told me about it, depending on who that friend is, I might just kind of be like, oh, that's cool, that worked for you, cool, and then still go on about what I'm doing. But when it's like if somebody I really respect, I'll actually try something new, even if it's counter to my own current common sense. That's why there have been times where I've been open to still reading a book that's considered new agey, because I start to think, okay, even if I can't fully buy into everything that's here, for instance, let's say we're talking about energies and things of that nature. It's not something that we have so many empirical studies about that we can.
Well, technically, energy is real, just not in the way they describe it.
So that's the thing.
The different forms of energy.
There's a book I'm reading currently. I'll admit it. Why not? There's a book I'm reading. It's called Levels of Energy by Frederick Dodson. It's basically he has this. Not to get too much into it. This was recommended by somebody who's a mentor. That's why I decided to check it out. Right. And also, again, just as a preface, when I look at these things, I try to just take what is most practical and whatever agrees with my common sense, without necessarily going to some place where I can no longer relate it to someone I'm talking to about it. Because you start getting into these areas where it's like, if you're talking about like, I don't know, say somebody says something about spirits or whatever, I don't know, I don't know about that world. And I'm probably assuming that other people don't necessarily know about it either. Yeah, but if, let's say he has something in here, it's like a scale of energy, right? Where at the bottom there's like apathy, shame, guilt, like all this kind of suffering stuff, and as you move higher, like more positive emotions, like let's say like we have shame, guilt over here, then we have like anger or something like that, then we have like pride, then we have just boring, routine, functionality, something like that, then working determination, working hard, whatever, and then all these things, right? Okay, so when he goes through it in his book, everything seems to make sense, all that, and it describes like how people act at these varying energy levels and all that. Cool, practical, great. But then when it goes into these other areas, it's like I can't necessarily relate it to another person, so I won't look at that. What was the point of me bringing this up, right? It's just like if somebody who I trust tells me to check something out, I'll try to look at it and try to see what's most practical about it. Yeah, so that's the thing. So in that sense, like that's my realism, kind of going into it, without necessarily disregarding that source, because I don't know. I like to think, why do some people think the way they do? For instance, say somebody's very religious and all that. And then maybe they cite a story that, you know, we can't confirm or deny actually occurred in history. I still would be interested in their perspective and all that. I guess my issue starts to come when, like, maybe somebody touts something as being absolutely true, and you can't necessarily, I guess, prove it or something like that. I guess that's where my issue, like, I have an issue.
I hear you.
But I still am interested in those perspectives, even if it's something that's not necessarily scientific or academic.
Yeah, and there's that kind of glass half full thinking, that there's something you can learn from almost anything. And you know what I also wonder? If like the true optimist is not necessarily true, I guess, kind of tough term, but I mean like the kind of the grounded, let's say, optimist. Yeah, that's a better term. So the grounded.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
That should be a book title. By the way.
You know what I mean?
We're gonna copyright that.
The grounded
optimist.
Yeah.
That's okay.
You don't even know what it is. So the grounded optimist, I think, is someone who, it's not that they necessarily believe that things will go well, but I think that they don't use mental filtering, right? So where they sort of, so you know, like the person who mental filters is like the one who like just focuses, or like this is unconscious, right? So they automatically focus on all of the negative stuff and all of the ways that things can go wrong, right? And the pessimist, the true pessimist, is one who focuses on the things that they believe will go wrong. And so I think that the sort of the grounded optimist is one that focuses on like knowing that obviously things could go wrong, knowing that things sometimes do go wrong, but they actually actively choose to focus on all of the things that can go right, and then they also choose to focus on all of the good in their lives. So it's like you kind of refocus on what's important to you, right? So it's like the grounded optimist is not somebody who's necessarily unaware, like let's say with mental filtering, you're not aware of the positives, right? It's something that your brain just pretends isn't there. So like if somebody is really depressed and you're like, hey, do you think that there's anything good about your life? You'd be like, no, there's absolutely nothing, like everything is terrible. So the grounded optimist who understands that reality is this kind of mixed bag, I think they would tell you, have you ever seen the movie The Whackness by any chance? Oh my god, such a good movie. Okay, so in the film, like, there's this really great scene with this kid. So he's like this really like kind of depressed and like really negativistic thinking kid. And so like the girl who he's in love with, she's like, look man, she's like, you have this really shitty way of looking at life. She's like, you literally focus on all of the whackness of it. She's like, what I do is I focus on all of the dopeness of it, right? And he's like, oh, holy shit, right? She's like, yeah, that's why you're so unhappy. She's like, literally all you think about is like all of the bad stuff. Unfortunately for like him, she didn't really understand that it wasn't something that he was actively doing. His mind just literally didn't, because that's how depression works. Your mind, unless you become aware of it, right, your mind just like doesn't believe that there's anything good about your life. But I think that, again, going back to the grounded optimist, it's somebody who understands that there are bad things that probably, or most likely will happen, that bad things have happened, that there are parts of their lives that they don't really like, but they choose instead to focus on the good. So they choose to focus on their strengths, they choose to focus on the good aspects of their lives, the things they've achieved, the people that they love, the people that they're around. They focus on the things that they have to look forward to, and then whenever they have a particular endeavor, right, they try to focus on, or they try to tell themselves that, let's say in terms of a risk assessment, they try to focus on the likelihood, whatever that is for whatever different endeavor, of the good that can come out of whatever their, let's say, action or activity is. So it's like they kind of like going back to that glass half full kind of thinking. They say to themselves, okay, so I know what the risk is, let's say in this particular endeavor, right, but I'm going to try to focus on all of the good that can come out of it, and then I'm also on top of that going to focus on the immediate good that comes out of it. So if it's, let's say, us starting a podcast, right, so it's a long journey, right, we all know that. It's something that takes probably years sometimes, literally. So if for me, I think a grounded optimist would say, okay, like I know that there's a very good chance that this is like a really, really good chance, right, that this isn't going to go like, you know, where I want it to in the long term. So, but what I want to do is I want to focus on the potential of it being something like, let's say, bigger in the long term, or being something special. And then also on top of that, I'm going to focus on all of the good things that I can take away from it in the short term, right? So what I try to do, and this is like my trying to actively be an optimist, is I try to focus on the things that I get, like now with you and I sitting here, right? Like I learned a ton of stuff from you today, which is like really fucking cool, which is, I'm sure you can tell by my excitement. I'm like, oh wow, like this is great. And then on top of that, I came up with different ideas for my own self. Then I'm like, holy shit, these are connections that I wasn't even able to make before. So these are things in the short term that I've taken away, and I could tell myself, oh, so not only have I learned something, right, not only have I enjoyed this conversation, but then on top of that, let's say if even 5 people listen to this show, those 5 people will probably take something away from it. So that's what I think a grounded optimist is. It's like in the back of my mind, I know there's a very like pretty low chance of this like ever becoming anything close to like, let's say, the Rogan experience. Obviously the hope is there, right, but it's not an expectation, because obviously it's very unlikely. But the point is that I can also say, but that's not as important as all of these other positive things about it.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement with you, actually.
Yeah,
because for instance, even if only one person watched the show, if something that we said, either you or I or both or whatever, or one of our guests or something like that, actually changed or helped somebody in their own personal life, that to me is a big deal. The fact also that we're doing it on the internet is good, because that means that the amount of people that you could potentially help, as opposed to kind of locally, like say, okay, by the way, I preface to this is I totally think that therapy is amazing and all, and that's it. Therapy is amazing for sure. Yeah. So yes. However, how interesting is it that there are times that when you're speaking, there's people. Like, say we had a video with, let's say, 150 views or something like that, and out of those 150 people, let's say, just for fun, I don't even know how to quantify this, but let's say 70 people were influenced by you. You just literally, it's not the same thing as a session, right?
Because it's not personal, right?
Yes, but how interesting is that the amount of people that you can impact is increased when already you've made it your life's purpose to be a therapist. That's just monumental, right?
That's true.
Yeah, so on one level, yes, if the idea is, we're trying to be the successful podcast, all that, and potentially, there's these things that, like, you think that you should be thinking about when you make a podcast. Like, for example, like, do we monetize this? When do we monetize this? How do you do this kind of marketing? How do you do that?
When does Joe Rogan call us?
When does Joe Rogan call us, right? He's like, oh, he shaved his head. Okay, it's time. He's ready. He's initiated. No, I'm just kidding. And so
his people will reach out.
Yeah, like, oh, there's another. He's joined the fold.
Yeah.
But yeah. But anyway, whatchamacallit. Yeah, and that stuff is important. I suppose, like, to me, it's not so important. Even the fact that we have, this is the 29th episode, right? Realistically, this is my thought. I don't think we're supposed to have thousands of people right now listening.
I hear.
Unless you're somebody like Eric Weinstein, who, for instance, already, and this is not, he had other things that he's accomplished, for sure. But the fact that he was on Rogan already,
right? And
then when he has his own podcast, of course, his first show is going to be like 200,000 people.
And Sam Harris, yeah.
Hell yeah. So, like, barring cases like that, it's a journey, right? So, the pessimistic view could be like, well, after the first 5 episodes, it didn't do so well. We didn't have that many people. The quality is shit. There's an echo here. There's that. We should stop, right?
Yeah.
And then we could have stopped. But if we did, let's say we stopped at episode 5.
Crazy.
Who the hell, like, for example, having Emmy on, personally, I loved. I love all our guests, by the way. Keith Frankish, Napoleon, Emily, recently.
Yeah.
Really, I would just name all of them right now. The reason I'm not is just because of I'm just trying to give an example here. But, like, the kinds of people that we met and had conversations with or just interviewed.
Yeah.
Come on, right. If we had stopped with a pessimistic view, where, there's benefits to it. Like, one, it's benefits to the people who are listening, but also just even if you want to be selfish about it, how cool is it that you get to, like, interact with this level of person, right?
Yeah.
You shouldn't be ideally selfish. I'm just saying, if you try to just find all these little things that are interesting about, like, what we're doing, there's that. And then also the way I think about it is that it's a long-term process, right? So in that sense, you can argue that's optimistic, right? I think it's about you kind of just do the work. You think about offering value. You think about, like, what's the person listening, like, what are they getting out of this? And that's really what should be the main concentration. And then all these little other variables feel so distracting to me. They're important, but I feel like they just, like, mess with the ability to produce. Like, for example, like, oh, how many views did we get? Like, it's good. Like, I think it's important. I think, here's the thing. Here's why I think, okay, so for example, our partnership, right? I feel like there are certain things that I contribute and there's certain things that you contribute that when combined, that's interesting. It creates, like, an emergent that is more than the sum of its parts, right? Sorry, more than each individual part. The sum is something greater than what you would think would be the...
You technically said that.
I said. Yeah. Anyway, what was I going for there? Yeah, so... and also, I think I like that, for example, sometimes, let's say, not to get too specific, but let's say one of us is not happy with like the current trajectory, right? That's actually not so bad, because maybe one person is going into their like a pessimistic side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And then we start to actually think, like, what can we do to improve the quality? Not necessarily stop, but then we start to think, like, what action can you take to alter the trajectory that we're on? And I think that's one thing that's amazing about pessimism, is that it can kind of push you to take action sometimes. Because if you think that everything's not going so well...
Absolutely,
then you start to think, what can I do to make it go well?
Right.
Instead of this optimistic view of, for example, let's say that view that I'm touting, where I'm like, no, it's just a long-term process. We just keep doing it, hammering at it. Right. And I think there's truth to it.
That's true.
It's not wrong, but there's this other side to it that adds this element of taking different sorts of actions.
Right.
That might be a blind spot to that optimistic view.
Yeah, because if the optimistic, I think what you're saying is that if the optimist says to him or herself that, like, oh, well, things are going great, right, and we should just continue things as they are, there won't be any significant change, or potential, obviously, significant change.
Yeah, for instance, you can't tell right now, the audience can't tell, but we have another camera here. Leon could see it, right? And so, for instance, the next time that we're going to be having a Skype feed with somebody, they'll actually be able to see us. And we always, they actually, I don't know if anyone knows this is watching, they can never see us. They can only hear us. So that'll be like a little change. And here's the thing, like, for me, I didn't think about getting that piece of equipment, right? This is real. I didn't think about getting it, because I was thinking everything's fine the way it is. It's long-term process. You know, you don't need to... I mean, I didn't think you don't need to improve something, but it's very slow in that.
Right.
But then, whereas you're like, no, I mean, hey, let's upgrade this. Let's do that. Let's add this functionality. Let's see if we can do this or that.
Right.
It kind of... It does something interesting as well. And it has its own value. So I don't think being optimistic all the time, or at least like higher on that optimistic spectrum, is always as valuable as you would think. For instance, I would recommend, here's the thing, I don't ever say like be the pessimist, but I think it's always good to have a pessimist around you, because it sort of grounds you in reality, right? So
I hear you.
Depends. You have to kind of see with, you know, where this agrees with your own common sense. Yeah, like for anyone listening, maybe, yeah, you'd have to kind of sift through what we're saying and kind of see how it, how it goes with your own common sense, right?
Right, and I think maybe even so, I think a great, I don't know if it's a takeaway necessarily, but a great idea for me that comes from this is sort of calibrating one's expectations, right? So I think a lot of times the sort of optimist expects too much from the work that they've put in, and then the pessimist essentially expects like no kind of outcome from the work they've put in, where they feel hopeless. Again, we're talking about two extremes, right? And so interesting.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
I would have said the opposite.
What?
I would have said that well, yeah, I guess you're right. I feel like the optimist would also be like, hey, if it's not going so well, it's because of this or because of that, and then we need to change this.
So I hear you, and I think that that's more toward the realistic side of the spectrum, or the realistic middle. Yeah, I hear you. So I'm talking about the extreme sort of, I guess, and now I don't want to really use this term, delusional optimist, right? The one who is like, everything is going to be great. Like, life is just, like, you know, you have people who are like...
Because you'd have a blind spot to anything not going
So, like, you know how, like, people say, like, oh, things will just work themselves out. And it's like, no, man, nothing is going to work itself. Like, if you don't actually do something, somebody else is just going to make a decision for you. Could work out, it could not, but the point is that it's not necessarily going to work out just because you decide to wash your hands of it. So, what I find a lot of times is that we have to really calibrate our expectations to reality. So, it's like, for somebody who's pessimistic, right, they're saying to themselves, essentially, like, my expectations are very low, right? No matter how hard I try, it's not going to go anywhere. This is the extreme. The other extreme is like, oh, like, I don't really have to do that much. Things are just going to be wonderful, right? That's the kind of other extreme of optimism. And so there was this really great quote that I read from Sky Cleary's Twitter page, and I wanted to read it to you, because I don't know if you got a chance to see it, but it was so good, man. And I think we could have a really good conversation about this. So, hold on, let me just... And then, so she took it from... Okay, so This is from, okay, so this is not technically from her account. This is from a woman named Andrea Long Chu. And so she's a writer for like the New Yorker. She writes for the Boston Review, New York Times Opinion, etc. So she says, right, so she wrote, disappointment is not how it feels when the object of your attachment fails to give you what you want. Rather, disappointment is how it feels when you fail to detach yourself from the disappointing object. You ought to break up, but you don't. What's disappointing, in other words, is your own optimism. Your continued belief in the world's being enough for the desires that you tether to it, all evidence being to the contrary.
Wow.
Right? So she's pretty much saying that, like, for some people, they're so optimistic that they refuse to let go of the kind of the goals and the aspirations that they have. Their reality is telling them ain't gonna happen, ain't gonna come true. So, like, you sometimes have people who are so delusionally optimistic where, so a good example of this is, let's say a client walks in and they're like, hey, like I broke up with let's say my girlfriend, right? So I broke up with my girlfriend, but I know we're gonna get back together. It's like, okay, why do you think that? Oh, because she loves me. Why? Okay, why? Because, well, she told me many times in the past, right? Okay, so what's the recent evidence? Recent evidence says, hey, look, things were really going great, but like, because of the stuff that you said, some of the things that you've done, I'm no longer in love with you, right? And I obviously wish you the best and I want you to move on. So he says, no, I'm not going to move on, right? That's the sort of, kind of delusional optimist. So he says, absolutely not. Why would I move on? She's in love with me. I'm not going to let that go. I have to fight for her, right? Mm-hmm. This whole fighting for thing. So evidence is telling you essentially that no, you have to move on because your goals aren't going to come true. So as somebody who's in the more realistic kind of, sphere, right, or in the middle of the spectrum, they would say, you know what, I'm going to calibrate my expectations to reality. So my expectation is that because I think, let's say I'm a decent looking guy, I have a reasonable amount of things to offer in a relationship, my expectation is I'm going to go and find someone else, right? And I'm not going to be maybe as much of a dick as I was before with her. So the kind of unrealistic and delusional optimist would say, like, no, my expectation is that I'm going to be with her. So it's like reality is telling you absolutely not. Like, you cannot be that optimistic in this sort of sense, in this relationship, because everything is telling you, no, stop it. So one of two things is going to happen with this person. So either they're going to continue in their kind of delusion, right, and they're going to say, no, I'm going to keep fighting for it, and have like these moments of sadness because eventually your mind like realizes you're not getting what you want. Or eventually they break, unless, let me not say there are only two, because technically there could be some sort of realistic thinking eventually, right? But the two sort of extremes that occur are, on the one hand, these people continue in their pursuits, and even despite the sadness, the little sort of pangs of sadness that come up because they understand they're not getting what they want, they still continue. They're like, no, they're going to be stubborn in it. But then you have another kind of end of the spectrum which says, like, I'm just going to give up now altogether, right? Like, I feel devastated, right? There was this thing that I expected and I wanted, and I didn't actually get it, right? So the problem there was the expectation that this person expected this girl to take him back. So regardless of what the evidence was saying, there was a part of his mind that says, no, she loves me, she's going to be back. And then eventually, if that realization does set in, this person's heartbroken and devastated, not because of anything that happened, because she already broke up with him, right? She kind of told him, and if he accepted reality, we could have said, hey, I kind of knew what was going on. But he was so devastated because his expectation was to get back with her. And obviously, in a way, that's a defense and a kind of coping mechanism, because one can even argue that he would have been devastated beforehand if he really accepted that she was breaking up with him. So he was like sort of kicking the can down the road, right? So, but the point is that there are some people that are so optimistic, right? And it's just that they're like delusionally so, and like it's counterproductive to their well-being, because like I know I said earlier that you can kind of be an optimist. It's healthy sometimes to be an optimist in the sense of because it affects, let's say, your health. So you could definitely put that in the spectrum, right? Or rather that in this kind of like bucket. Mm-hmm. And you could say, well, technically what did he have to lose, right? He thought that she was going to get back with him and it made him happier knowing that this was going to happen, yada yada. So the point here is that the consequence of his like realization, or right, the consequence of like something wild that he could have done and gotten himself in trouble for, is not worth the sort of sense of optimism that he felt, right? To prevent himself from feeling devastated. So my kind of pretty much in a nutshell, my major point is that a lot of times it's the expectations, right, from that optimistic thinking that become debilitating for us, because we eventually kind of, I think for the most part, that we eventually realize that the things that we want are not going to happen, right? Eventually, I think like your brain kind of gets it. Like if, I don't know, he pursued this girl for like years, there had to have been a point where he would have said, you know what, maybe this isn't happening, and now I'm feeling the devastation that he could have sort of felt before, and if he had experienced that grief then, what hopefully would have happened is that he would have gone through the process and then moved on to someone else. So, like, one side of optimistic thinking says, you know what, I guess, this is an interesting way of compartmentalizing it. So, one form of optimism says, you know what, I expect myself to find someone because I'm good enough. And the other point of optimism says, like, no, I expect me to get back with her, right, because she loves me. So, it's like, on the one hand, you're like, I need her for my kind of own self-esteem. And then the other hand, you're like, no, I already feel good enough. So I know if it's not her, it'll be somebody else. So it's just, I guess, different ways of kind of viewing optimism. And I guess I don't know obviously what Seligman said about it, but this is the sort of way I can see it of going like really, really kind of wrong. Of like making or expecting the world to provide what you expect for it to give.
Damn, yeah, because it is all about managing expectations.
Right.
And I suppose the grounded optimist would be someone who would think along the lines of, I can meet someone else.
Right.
I have a lot to offer.
Yep.
Things like that. The other side of it, is that delusional sort of optimism where you think you're going to get back together with her and all that. And honestly, while even listening to that story, just to detach from like what lesson we're just trying to learn from here, that's so sad, man. That's so bad. I've been there. I'm sure you've been there too, maybe. To some extent.
I want to be honest with you on this one. Have I? Yes, I think I have. You know what the thing? I can't think of an example, but I'm going to say yes because you know what it is. My intuition is telling me I've definitely been there, but my brain can't think of examples. But I have to have.
Yeah, so I've definitely been there, and oh man, I respect the struggle and the resilience. There is something that kind of happens to your character throughout that whole kind of process.
I hear you.
But damn, I feel bad for that dude. But yes, what is the lesson from here? It's important to manage your expectations, sort of be able to look at all these sort of different sides, look at facts as well, and sort of kind of gauge, how to what path to take moving forward.
Right. I would say, you know what was helpful for me to look at it in terms of likelihoods. Like what I would tell someone like that, I would say, okay, I mean, technically you're right? Is it possible that she'll get back with you? Absolutely. Technically it's true, right? It's a possibility. But how likely is it that she'll get back with you knowing what you know? And then maybe we can kind of quantify it as best as we can. So let's say if you were to say, well, there's a 10% chance. I'd be like, okay, so is the 10% chance worth this risk, right? Is the 10% chance worth you taking the risk of spending all of this time, right, pursuing her and then potentially being devastated in the end anyway, right? Is that 10% worth it? Some people would say yes, some people would say no. And by the way, some people would be still so delusional where they say, oh no, it's 100%. She's definitely getting back with me. And then I'm like, okay, I guess it's time to evaluate the evidence.
It kind of goes to that example too of where like if somebody is see again there's nothing wrong with positivity.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with optimism. But if somebody is overly positive, not necessarily overly optimistic, but here's the thing. Say somebody kind of comes to you and they're expressing something that happened to them and they don't feel so great. It's somebody who's coming from that overly optimistic, overly positive side of things would find it very hard to empathize with that person.
Yes.
And that's probably where trying to find the balance between pessimism and optimism is stressed. Like because
wait, can you say more about that? Like, why would that person find it harder to empathize?
Say I told you a family member just died recently, like, and you say, "Oh man, it's okay, it's okay. Death happens. It's a natural part of life." Why are you sad about that?
You have so much good in your life. Focus on that instead.
Focus on that instead. Why do you care about...
Look at how many people I care for you.
Yeah. And also, it happens. It happens. It's a normal thing. It happens every day. How many people die every day? And then to me, if I said that and somebody said that to me... I mean, they're technically right, right? Is that person correct in what they just said? Sure. But would that not feel like the most messed up thing ever when somebody kind of comes at you with that sort of attitude? Yeah, and so there would be sort of this mismatch in the conversation between that person who's expressing this, maybe, for example, grief, and then this person who's relating from this very positive perspective.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like that's why it's important to sort of be able to calibrate properly, because to be optimistic is fantastic. It's definitely good, and it's going to serve you in most situations, if not all situations, very well. But the ability to sort of measure where you should be coming from depending on the situation is important. It definitely is. I also, in that example with the guy who might be trying to get his girlfriend back,
Right.
you have to measure what are the facts of the situation. Is there really an opening for you guys to talk it out again, and then maybe something can come of that?
Yeah.
Or is this just delusional? It's coming from this need, from this lack,
Right.
where you need to. No, I must have this person. They told me before that they love me. It's they said all these things to me before.
Right.
So it must still ring true, even though they'll have a blind spot to this recent thing that occurred.
Right.
That in her mind is just this glaring reason for why she's not with him.
Yeah,
This is an example. I don't know the facts of the case.
No, it's not even real. Technically, it's something I just made up. Right?
There you go.
Yeah. So,
But it happens. This
No,
is a fairly common.
It definitely does. And
Yeah.
so it's interesting because like what that person would do in that scenario is they would just cherry pick information, right? So that's pure confirmation bias. So I already believe that she's going to get back with me. Why? Because she told me she loved me. We had all of these great moments, yada yada. So yes, all of those things are true, but you're not looking at the plethora of information. Sure, you're only focusing on the things that you want to focus on.
Yeah, you're depending on what mindset you have at the time, your thinking becomes very selective.
Yeah.
And then the measure to which you can have like a sort of balanced view on a situation is to the degree you can actually calibrate, like legitimately calibrate, as opposed to sort of default to your. I don't know how to put this so well. It's like I feel like I'm developing a thought right now. It's like if you default to a mindset that you usually have, without calibrating to the situation, it may serve you, it may not serve you. Hence the importance of calibrating, or if that's a word that maybe somebody's not familiar with who's listening, adjusting.
Yeah.
Adjusting, calibrating, same thing. So, I suppose that's the biggest distinction in measuring the pros and cons of optimism and pessimism is the ability to kind of calibrate along that spectrum.
Yeah.
If you can think from both sides.
Right.
If you can't, if somebody's dealing with if somebody is purely pessimistic, then learning to be optimistic is valuable.
Right.
And that's probably a good place to start. If somebody is overly optimistic, it would also be good to learn about being able to consider the pessimist's point of view. I wouldn't say necessarily become a pessimist, because again, there's a lot of positive traits to
And you technically can't, right? So it's just to sort of think more along the lines of a pessimist every once in a while.
Yeah. So I guess the nuanced thing here is definitely it's calibration.
Right.
Depending on the situation. Yeah.
You know what we do in, remember what I told you about the cognitive thought record? So we do like this question of like, what's the worst that can happen? Like, what's the best that can happen? That's technically from both ends, right? So the pessimist has this, so it's 3 questions technically. It's like, what's the worst outcome? What's the best outcome? What's the likely outcome? So the person tries to consider it from all 3 spectrums. So they first go to the best, then they go to the worst, and then they're like, what's the likely outcome? Technically it could be one of the 2, right? But it's usually something in the middle. Yeah.
You know, one thing I wanted to say about somebody who is very optimistic. So you touched on this before. Say someone is there's some sort of endeavor that they're pursuing, right? I don't remember if you said a specific example or not, but let's say somebody. Okay, let's use podcasting as an example, right? So let's use both of us. Okay, we're pursuing podcasting, and. So, say we have a lot of like certain metrics that show us that there's no increase in viewership or something like that. Or if we change this, there was still no increase in like if we change the sort of marketing, whatever, there was still no increase, all that, right? And maybe somebody who's objectively would say, there's no change here, so why are you still doing what you're doing, right? Isn't it delusional to be pursuing that course of action?
Right.
I would argue no, because even if it looks like that, you can't really know you can't predict the future, right? And if you did hinge your bets on, still taking action, on still making attempts where there were failures before, I still say that even if it looks like nothing is going to happen, I still would argue that taking action in that direction of as if something is going to happen will get you results that you never would have, that you never could have predicted from the pessimistic mindset.
Most definitely.
So even if somebody is, I used some kind of example before. It's like if somebody's delusionally optimistic, where they think like they're going to succeed even if all evidence points contrary to that. I would actually still, because it's a very strange. This is a very strange area. I feel like I'm in.
Right.
But so a lot of times, what ends up happening with people who undertake, like, let's say an entrepreneur, right? They're starting their new business, or they're starting their new whatever it is, and maybe their friends tell them, like, or a family, they're like, you shouldn't pursue this. Do the practical thing.
Right.
Get a job. Get a this. Get a that. And by the way, those are all valid. I'm not saying they're not valid at all. And here's the thing. It's strange because you have to like gauge, like, sometimes people tell you things like that. One, they care about you. That's usually...
Sometimes they're haters.
Sometimes they're haters, right? And that's important to make that distinction.
Right.
Sometimes it's not even just that they're haters. They might not even be a hater. It might come off like they're hating, but it's just so outside of their reality, what it is that you want to do, that the advice that they give is just almost like a projection of what they think is the correct course of action. But they couldn't possibly know what is the correct course of action for you, because they couldn't possibly take all the variables that kind of make up who you are into account in terms of pursuing something that is unknown to them.
Yeah, so they project their own insecurity onto you. That's a hater.
Not necessarily.
I hear you.
It looks like that, but not necessarily. Because I feel like when you assume that they're hating, I feel like that adds something like a layer to your interaction with them that may not necessarily be true.
Also depends on what they say in their tone, by the way.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So somebody who's overly optimistic, I wouldn't tell them not to necessarily still do that. There might be like, what is it? The path of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. I forgot what that quote. Yeah, I think the quote goes like that. Sometimes an extreme path can give you results. So I would say, if somebody has like a goal that they're pursuing and everyone does not agree with them in their goal, I think still that there is something to somebody still pursuing it, thinking that they can achieve it when everyone else disagrees with the fact that they can or whatever. So I feel like there's like a distinction to be made there. It's very nuanced.
I hear you. So, and interestingly enough, in psychology, it's also the same thing, by the way. We can't, like, always know when somebody's being delusional or not. So that's the thing. So it's sometimes like stuff happens where somebody will tell you some like wild story, and then it'll actually turn out to be true. But the point is just that it's rare, right? So in terms of likelihoods, if somebody does tell us something outlandish, we kind of tend to assume that it's probably not true, but we keep like a little bit of an open mind and say, okay, technically we can be wrong. So I would say the same thing here in terms.
No, that's if you're a level-headed. Yeah, of course. If you're going to be a level-headed thinker about it, of course. Right. But I'm just saying, like, because somebody might get feedback. Coming from that overly optimistic sort of point of view, that almost kind of tells them to stop what they're doing, and I'm not in agreement with that. But it's definitely a complicated area because you can even tell from my hesitation here, because on one level I almost want to tell somebody like, no, you want to be level-headed. On another level it's like, hey, am I telling somebody to think like me?
Right.
Or, I don't necessarily want to do that.
That's true. And you know what's also interesting? So it's like, technically, if you kind of also think about it, because evidence is also, I guess, a lot of times uncertain. So it's easy for one person, I guess, to say to themselves, you know what, based on like everything that I know, that it's unlikely for this course to, let's say, come to fruition, right? So it's like, for me, it's not worth the risk. But then maybe somebody else says like, no, you should try anyway, and I really believe that you can do it. And so I know what the evidence says, but just still try, like, for whatever reason, I don't know. But then the person still says to themselves like, I don't want to do it, right? So they don't. But then somewhere down the line, they're convinced, they're like, you know what, whatever, screw it, I don't really have much else to lose, right? It is what it is, you know, I have nothing better going on. So they try this thing, and then it sort of comes out that like, oh shit, like this really turned into something special. So this sort of the kind of delusional optimist was right? But that's only because this other person sort of had incomplete information of, you know, based on which to analyze whether or not to take a certain amount of, well, it's not a certain amount, to whether or not to take a certain path. So here's the thing, like, I guess in terms of being a rational, logical thinker, we also have to accept it's quite possible that the person that we take to be a delusional optimist can obviously be right, that whatever he or she says can actually turn out to be true, because even though we can try to be as logical as possible, we never have complete information to know where something will go.
Yeah. Plus, there are other dynamics at play.
Yeah.
For instance, if somebody
we don't know all the variables.
Yeah. Plus, if somebody is, one of the traits of somebody who's optimistic is confidence.
Right.
And if somebody's very confident in what it is that they're saying to you, depending on how they present it is what it is that they're saying, you may actually accept it as truth, because a lot of times if somebody sounds confident, we tend to believe what it is that they're saying.
Right.
And it may be one of those cases where, like, I forgot what that quote is, I might butcher it a little bit, but it's like, I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me. So maybe sometimes that person who's still delusionally optimistic can actually get into like crazy results as well.
Yeah.
So it's rough because it's a very like situation based sort of a thing. They may even be able to influence things. Right. Even if they're wrong. If they get enough people to be compliant or kind of go with what it is that they're saying.
Yeah. So I think maybe the main takeaway of what we're saying is that you should at least keep somewhat of an open mind. To say that, look, based on my risk assessment, I think that like X either will or will not happen, right? And maybe there's, let's say, a 90% chance that it will or will not happen. But then we also have to take into consideration that we don't have all of the information necessary. And there's whatever amount of possibility, obviously, but there's some chance, which might even increase over time with your endeavor, right? Like technically for us with the podcast, our sort of the chances of this becoming something special has increased, right? In the beginning, we kind of started out with just us, and then we have then we got a guest here or there, and then we got more guests, and now people are reaching out to us, which is like wild. I'm like, holy shit, right? So it's like, if you think about it, so like even though our chances aren't great, they're like literally increasing kind of like by the week at least.
For me, it's wild. Like, I'll be honest with you, my expectations when we started this was just more like, here's what I thought. I thought, okay, so we're gonna do this. Okay, all right. Then I was thinking, okay, so we just do the work, we offer value, that's all got to concentrate on, because otherwise I didn't know what other variables to kind of hold in my head. I was just like, let's just do this, do the best we can, and that's it, right? Then all these things started happening, right, that I never would have expected. I definitely wasn't, I was optimistic in the sense that I believed in long-term work and a discipline to... at least doing the work, doing the show, all that, and being consistent.
Right.
In that sense, I was optimistic. But I never imagined, like, the level of guests that we would have had or anything like that. Even still to this day, I don't even know how much I really think about, like... I think the show's already special. I'm not, like, thinking in my head, like, I want more views or all that. Because actually, to be honest... There's a part of me that's kind of like, there's a part of me that almost doesn't, it's probably because I'm just not used to this reality, where I'm just like, I don't know if I want that many views, right? But that's just more of an insecure sort of a thing. as opposed to like what I actually want. I do, the real purpose is impact as many people as possible with information that's not so mainstream. And there are people who are doing that, but apparently not enough.
Yeah.
Apparently.
And from what I listen to, I think we offer like other types of value than other people do. So like,
Sure.
yeah, like I think like we, like with Rogan and let's say with Silva, who else is there? Who else is like, obviously Scott Barry Kaufman, right? So like these different people, I think like when I listen to their shows, it's not so much that we talk about different things. I think we're in line in terms of the themes that we cover. Like I don't know, I guess whatever, kind of happiness, optimal thinking, etc. But I think that we provide additional value in those sort of contexts, which is I think really cool.
Sure. And if anything, here's the thing. One thing I learned is there's certain people you resonate with who you choose to listen to, right? There may be another person who says essentially the same thing that Rogan says, or Silva says, or Aubrey Marcus, whatever.
Yeah.
All that. But for some reason, there's a reason that I would that I gravitate to whoever it is I gravitate to. Because it's just something about them is more relatable, or something along those lines. So I'm sure the fact that we're doing it, we have our own sort of something that someone else can resonate with.
Yeah. You know what's so cool, man? I literally just realized this. I actually had a breakthrough, literally in the moment while you were saying that.
Wow.
Like in terms of, so we're like so focused on, and I guess this is kind of my counter idea, if whatever you can call it that. So as you were saying that, like, we kind of provide a lot of value for people, then I started thinking about the things that we talked about, right? So because my brain goes like in a million directions. Then I started thinking about like when we talked about that dating episode, right? And just going out and doing stuff. And when I was like, oh yeah, like if you just go get rejected, which is what you should want to do, right? Eventually you're not going to feel anxious. So then I started thinking about our first episodes when I was like super anxious and when you could tell in my voice, dude, so here's my breakthrough. This is the first episode in the, 29 episodes that we done. Like, and I just noticed this now. I felt zero anxiety throughout the whole show.
Oh, hell yeah.
Crazy! Like, it actually worked. Like, you just keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and then eventually you're like, yeah.
I would say same here.
Yeah.
I did, okay, so just a little background info for everyone listening. I have this thing I do where sometimes before we start, I'll do this, like, cough thing.
Yeah.
It's just some kind of thing where I'm like I'm just ready to... I know something's about to happen and all that. So maybe I had that right before starting, but actually, like, throughout the whole process, very smooth. I did notice that like, whenever we do have... most of the time, once we're already doing the action...
Yeah.
all sort of... anything extra, like anxiety or whatever, goes away. I tend to actually not really have it unless it depends. Depends on the subject of the show and if I have something to contribute or not. If I don't, I'm like...
Yeah.
I'm like, and I'm like, Leon! Yeah, but whatchamacallit?
But yeah, for the most part, like, you're pretty okay.
No, 100%.
Yeah,
100%.
Yeah, for me, I'm actually not. So that's why, like, for me, I'm like, holy shit, I actually did not feel anxious at all.
You know what's hilarious? I can't believe I'm admitting this, but I'll admit it, sure. So you know how you said in the beginning you were more nervous? In the beginning, I was less nervous, actually. I was not nervous at all.
Yeah.
I'd actually be like, I was like, no, this will be good. I used to be that guy, remember? I used to be like, no, this is going to be a good episode, everything's going to be great, all that. And then what happened is there's like the shift that sort of took place. Like as we started getting more and more guests, then you started being more comfortable, and I started to be like, wait, what are we talking about today? History? Okay. Shit. I guess this is one where I'll ask questions because I don't really have... Actually, maybe I did have something to contribute at that time. But whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's these things you think about before a certain guest comes on.
And by the way, the questions are great contributions too.
No, 100%.
Right, because you literally steered the dialogue in a certain direction. Like with Keith, technically you and I were in the same boat, man. So with him, I had like very little I could sort of ask and say. But the point was that I think, if not necessarily in terms of like the value we provided, which I think we did because the questions I thought were important, but they were like indirect value. So based on our questions, he had these really like kind of long kind of form answers, right, and these really detailed answers. So through our questioning, he provided the answers, and then we indirectly provided value. So I think you do that a lot of times too. So it's like,
absolutely. And also just conversation will just sort of generate based on. So in the very beginning, you don't know where it's gonna go, but then once you start kind of going with it, someone will say something usually that sort of kind of sparks something in you to contribute. It's so coming into it beforehand, you don't know that that's gonna happen. So you kind of gotta just trust that the conversation will be good, right? So that's just, behind the scenes of podcasting as far as that goes.
Damn. I don't know. I think that's a great place to... Yeah.
Yes. So just, I know. We're like an hour and 17 in. Okay, fair enough. But then, could we end it with this?
Shoot.
What would you say to someone, or what would you suggest to someone who's coming from a very pessimistic sort of mindset? Like, how do you think that they could develop optimism?
Ooh, so I have this great quote, which is, it's from Neil deGrasse Tyson, but it's technically, I forgot where he got it from. I think he took it from Voltaire or something. So the quote is that science is science and facts are facts regardless of whether you believe them or not. So that's usually kind of a wake-up call for people, like, wait, holy shit, like, maybe I'm not seeing reality as it is, right? So the thing is, nobody wants to be pessimistic, which is really great. So the point is that when people struggle with severe depression, they think that their thinking is realistic, which is why I really, really dislike when people say, oh, well, haven't you seen the studies? Depression is linked to realistic thinking. I'm like, no, it's not. It's more nuanced than that. Mild depression is linked to more realistic thinking, right? So the point is that when somebody says that, like, when they tell you that they're pessimistic or whatever, they kind of give you all of these, like, really terrible beliefs about themselves, about life, right? They literally think they're being realistic, right? So when I say that, when I use that quote, they're like, wait, why are you telling me that? And I say, well, I'm just telling you that reality is what it is, right? And so they're like, but I believe what's real. I'm like, no, from the sound of what you're telling me, it sounds pretty pessimistic. And then they say, no, it's realistic. I'm like, okay, would you like to actually examine the evidence? And they would say, well, maybe I don't need to, right? And then I would say, okay, but then you don't really actually agree with the quote, right? Because what he's actually implying is that the evidence itself is what's important, apparently not so much to you. And then they would say, get defensive, no, let's do it, let's examine it. So kind of from
Smart.
Thank you. So from that quote, you kind of get this person to examine their lives, hopefully from a more objective standpoint, right? Where they're like, no, I'm dedicated to the truth. So naturally, as people, like, if not by our actions, at least in our thinking, we believe that we're dedicated to the truth. We want to be dedicated to the truth. Nobody wants to live in the matrix, right? And this is a whole episode in itself. Most people don't want that, right? Most people want to be in reality and see reality as it is. So the problem is pessimists actually believe that is a reality as it is. So what you would do with that kind of, let's say, with a person mostly engaged in that type of thinking, is you would say, okay, like, let's see what it is, right? If your reality is right, let's kind of try to examine it and go from there. Obviously, there could be a whole slew of defenses after this. I'm not saying it's that simple, obviously. Even while you examine the evidence, they could find ways to deny the evidence. And they could even sort of say that, oh, I don't need to obviously examine the evidence because I already have, which I said before, right? The point is there are definitely complications that could come up with this, and it's not that simple. But that's where I would start off.
If I had anything to contribute as far as, like, if somebody wants to, like, make that shift from pessimism to optimism, or even just to learn sort of more about the traits of pessimism, I would definitely recommend Martin Seligman's book, Learned Optimism, How to Change Your Mind and Your Life. To be fair, just honestly, I actually did not read the book. It might have sounded like I did.
It definitely did.
No, I watched some YouTube videos when I was looking up the traits of pessimism and optimism. And his book came up a lot. And also I did listen to him speak as well, different TED Talks as well, and also related to positive psychology. So if anyone wants to check out either his book or kind of like what I did, check out some videos on YouTube. It's definitely out there, so, please check it out.
Yeah, and be sure, guys, if you have any ideas or thoughts and kind of experiences of being either optimistic or pessimistic, leave us a comment in this, YouTube comment section below.
Absolutely. So, guys, that ends the episode. Remember to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Hit the bell, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.